morning.
Good morning.
I want to say a special good morning and welcome to our visitors. If you stick around after the services, we promise we won't rush off to go eat some free food at a potluck, and we'll get to know you instead. That's much more important to us, believe it or not, than a little bit of food. If you want to open up your Bibles to the book of Exodus 14, a familiar passage, as we're going to continue in a chapter that we kind of left off on not too long ago when we were already in chapter 14 after having crossed from the end of 13 into this dramatic scene of the Red Sea. We cross chapters, the children of Israel will pass through the sea. And in this chapter, as we just read, as Keenan told us, at the end of this chapter, the Israelites are trusting, they're believing in God, they're fearing God at the appearance of their persecutors, the Egyptians, that are dead on the seashore. Now that's interesting. I don't know about you, but to me that's really interesting that these people, the Israelites, are witnessing all of these dead bodies on the shore after this mass catastrophe event. And what we'll transcribe of that is chapter 15, and that is the Song of Moses, all of these praises. It's kind of weird, don't you think, that a lot of people will be celebrating the death of a whole bunch of people. I mean, you think about today, and there's mass casualty events, and people are just bewildered by how could this possibly happen? More than that, if God exists, how could this happen? And you almost have that principle here that people might question God. How can a good and loving God be responsible for the death of this giant army in mass, in one event? How can God be a good and a just God when he just killed a whole bunch of people? And I think that's an appropriate question to ask, and to look at that and to address that kind of a question, we're going to have to understand who God is, really. And the way to understand who God really is kind of to review a lot of parts of the book of Exodus that we've covered to understand this event right here and to understand the perspective that Israel now has of their God. And that should make an imprint on us also about how we see who this God really is. Namely, in accordance to, do we revere God, God's reverence, and also God's glory? And the place that I'm getting these two words are based first on what God says about himself in getting the glory over Egypt, and also just the reaction to God getting the glory. And you see now this newfound reverence for God by Israel. Backing up here into the text here, look what God says in Exodus chapter 14 and verse 17. This is God's words. And I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they shall go in after them. This is at the parting of the Red Sea. They will go in after them, and I will get the glory over Pharaoh and all his host, his chariots, and his horsemen. And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I have gotten glory over Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen. So what does this mean? How does God get the glory over someone? Is God just luring in this army so that he can destroy them to say, I'm so much better in this one event right here? When God says he's getting the glory, there is kind of this idea of he's getting a victory over a military, and rightly so, and that's exactly what seems to transcribe out of this event right here. But this isn't just random. This isn't just God wanting to flex over people, and so he chooses an army. There's actually a lot of history behind God getting the glory, getting the victory over Egypt, over Pharaoh himself. And that stems from Egypt making God their enemy. So let's go back to Exodus chapter 1, and I'll read this for you. Exodus chapter 1 and verse 8, we go all the way back to the beginning, and you see that this new Pharaoh has a fear of what might happen now that they have the Israelites sojourning in their land. This is the fear of an older Pharaoh that led to the events of the rest of Exodus. Exodus chapter 1, verse 8 says this, Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. And so they set taskmasters over them. Do you hear that? Here's Pharaoh's big fear. Israel is so big, and almost the first instinct is not, they might just run us over. Actually, their idea is, what if we have a war and the slaves go and join the enemies that we're fighting against? What if they go and join them? And then that's to our detriment. And not only that, what if they join them and then they escape? What if our slaves escape? Because there's so many of them and they join our enemies. And so out of that fear, this Pharaoh decides, let's just oppress them and let's put them under hard labor and make them awful slaves and make their lives absolutely bitter. And so what does God do in Exodus chapter 14? What has God been doing all of this time? God has taken Israel to his side, and now God is setting the slaves free. The very fear of Egypt is coming true. And so now you see that it's not just any group. It's not just any nation. No. This is God that is taking their slaves, fighting against Egypt, and the slaves are on God's side, and the slaves are being set free by this God. And so, in effect, Egypt has determined God is the enemy, and the Israelites are going free. And so now, what are they going to do about this, now that their worst fear has been passed down to a generation and is now becoming true? This is what they do. Back in Exodus chapter 14, verse 3. Well, let me read verse 1 here. Exodus chapter 14 in the beginning says this. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Tell the people of Israel to turn back and encamp in front of Pi-hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea, in front of Baal-zephon. You shall encamp facing it by the sea. For Pharaoh will say of the people of Israel, they are wandering in the land, and the wilderness has shut them in, and I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them. And I will get glory over Pharaoh and all his host, and the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord." And they did so. And how did they do that? When the king of Egypt was told that their people have fled, the mind of Pharaoh and his servants was changed toward the people. And they said this, "What is this that we have done? That we have let Israel go from serving us." So he made ready his chariot, and he took his army with him, and he took 600 chosen chariots, and all of the chariots over Egypt, and the officers over all of them. And the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he pursued the people of Israel, while the people of Israel were going out defiantly. The Egyptians pursued them, all Pharaoh's horses, and his chariots, and his horsemen, and his army. They're trying to make war against this God. God is their enemy, and they're trying to make physical war against this God and his people. And they've realized, we've let our slaves go, and now we're going to go and take them back. And to Israel's thinking, they're like, we'd rather go and serve the Egyptians again than die. What's going on here, God? And so God gets the glory over a people that have made God their enemy. Not just God, but has made God and his people the idea that they need to go and take an army against God and his people. And so God gets the glory, gets the victory over Egypt. Not only in battle, but in complete idea, Egypt has de-glorified God, and how they tell Israel how little their God is. You remember all the way back in the beginning, in the book of Exodus, the Israelites think we're going to be let go now that Moses is here, and the response from Pharaoh to that idea is take away the straw from them, but require the same quota of bricks that they're supposed to make. And when they complain against Pharaoh and say, "What's this injustice that you've done to us?" Pharaoh says, "Well, if you're so busy to go and worship this little God of yours, you know what's more important than worshiping God is you working for me. And so I'm going to make your work even harder. Because that's the kind of God that you serve. Your God is so little that, one, he's not worth going to worship. And number two, if he's your God, then he's just the God of the slaves. And so your God is as small as you are. And so I am bigger than that. I am more important than that as king of Egypt. And so I will have you create things for me. You will build my creations." And so in effect, Pharaoh, Egypt, has de-glorified God by placing themselves, their importance, their ideas, what they want to create over what God has created, over God's covenant. And so God destroys Egypt in this fantastic way by saying, "No, I'm more glorious than you will ever be. And I carry the victory over you because you have made me your enemy, and you have sought to brought me down." And God is also the God of justice, and so glory and justice must be intertwined here. See, Egypt has done plenty of injustices to Israel. We already talked about how they oppressed them as slaves in the beginning because they were afraid of them. And that doesn't even go back to think about the history that they had before with Joseph. God had sent Egypt Joseph. And God had put Joseph, this Hebrew, into a great position of power that had saved Egypt over this famine. Not just saved them, but they became the center point where people were coming to Egypt for relief. And so God had sent them a man to prepare them for a famine, be a source of a blessing for people all around them. Not only that, but had just blessed Egypt as a whole through Joseph, because people realized if Joseph was in your house, if Joseph was with you, God was with Joseph, and so you were going to be blessed because God was there if Joseph was there. And the Bible says that everything that Joseph put his hand to became prosperous because God was with them. So think about how Egypt had almost essentially become such a great nation because God had sent them Joseph. And their answer to that blessing is to forget Joseph and then to oppress all of Joseph's family as slaves. And then you move into this quota of bricks being demanded by taking away their materials and then punishing them for not meeting the quota. Do you think that's an injustice or do you think that's fair? That's unjust. And God is upholding justice by executing this destruction on Egypt, who has made God, the God of blessing, their enemy. Let's think about this in a different way here. And let me tell you about this different way by first saying that God needs to exist for there to be justice. God needs to exist for there to be justice. Without God, justice is relative. Without somebody to uphold this high truth of what's right and what's wrong, if that does not exist, then all we have are people's feelings and opinions, and whoever can control the other is essentially the one in control. It's not even right. It's not even wrong. If there is no God, there's no right or wrong, and then so there cannot be any justice. Think about this. The Nuremberg trials. I'm sure I've used this example before because it just works so well. Nuremberg trials. The Third Reich, after World War II, is put into court. And so you have the Third Reich that's being questioned and also being sentenced for all of the things that they had done to kill thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of Jews, right? And what's the response of these Nazis to the court? Well, at the time, it was legal. It was the law. It wasn't even just encouraged. It was actually the law that you could kill Jews. It was welcomed and it was promoted. So if it's the law, does that make it the ultimate truth? If something is the law, if it's the law, does that make it good? Does that make it right? You know, even in our country today, we're trying to change laws based on what people think is right and wrong. And so if the law can be changed, well, first, if it can be established by a man, and then if it can be changed by a man, then we're really dealing with people's opinions. Well, I think this is right, and I think this is right. And if we're dealing with people's opinions, then our opinion's the highest authority that we have. Well, how would you justify that? Well, what about people feel a certain way? Are feelings the ultimate truth? The way that somebody feels just make it right for them, wrong for them, and does it make it right and wrong for everybody else? Well, of course not. Feelings vary depending on people. Feelings vary depending on situation. Feelings vary depending on what's going on in the brain. And so if feelings aren't the ultimate authority, then opinions can't be the ultimate authority. And if opinions aren't the ultimate authority, the law can't be the ultimate authority, especially if the law is contrary to things that are truly good. Well, how do we find out if something's truly good? There must be something higher than the law, higher than opinions, higher than feelings. We have the need for a God that says, this is true, this is right, and this is wrong. And I will reward what's right, but I have to punish what's wrong. Egypt had made God their enemy, had enforced, not just encouraged, but made it the statute of the land to kill the infants. Is that right? Egypt was in power, and Egypt made it the statue. Is it right? God says that's not right. That was not right. I saw you do that, and I will judge you for that. Egypt had oppressed Israel in hard slavery. Was that right? Because Egypt was in control? God said, that's not right. And I'm letting these people go free. Not only am I letting them go free, these are my people and in my covenant. And I will bless them when they are with me. God is not stronger, Egypt might think, than our army. God is not bigger than us. God is not greater than the rules that we establish. But God says, no, I am greater than the number of people that you could ever acquire for yourself. I am more glorious than how glorious you might want to make yourself and present yourself. And I am the God of justice and truth, and I will glorify myself in executing justice and truth. And so your opinions are not as big as me. Your feelings are not greater than me. Contrary to what you think, the laws that you make are not bigger than the laws that I uphold for every single person in the land. And if I have to punish evil, then I will absolutely reward what's good. I will absolutely reward what's good. And so God takes those that see God as good and brings them to his side and says, you know what, I'm going to give you your own land, and I'm going to be in the midst of you. And I'm going to be your God, and you're going to be my people, and I am going to continually bless you and make you fruitful and prosper as long as we have this continued relationship, and you are my good people. You will always be blessed. And that calls each person to consider, what side do I want to be on here? If I recognize that there is a God of all of these things, then this God will get the glory over evil, and then he will bless those who honor and revere him. What side do I want to be on? Do I want to make God my enemy? Or do I want to be blessed by God? AD 155, Polycarp. Polycarp is about to be burned at the stake as a martyr, as a faithful Christian. And the proconsul is encouraging Polycarp to renounce his faith. You just give up this Jesus, and we'll let you go free. And the response of Polycarp to those that will kill him is this: for 86 years I have been his servant, and he has done me no wrong. And now, how can I blaspheme my king who saved me? 86 years of being blessed by God was not worth renouncing, even in the face of persecution, to just claim your life. The blessings that God provides over a long period of time, a lifetime of blessing, is worth holding fast to God and not being his enemy. Whether you're Egypt, whether you're the proconsul, whether you're anybody that thinks you're great, it's always better to be on the side of blessing and to die with that God, for that God. And so God's glory is mated with power and justice. God's glory is mated with his power and with his justice. And you see that Israel kind of puts that together as we fast forward now, as they're standing on the other side of the sea. And they see all of those that have made God their enemy and come against him and have absolutely lost, washed up on the seashore. And the reaction of Israel to this major event that they could not deny God has done is this in Exodus chapter 14, verse 30. Thus the Lord saved Israel that day from the hand of the Egyptians. And Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. Israel saw the great power that the Lord had used against the Egyptians. So the people feared the Lord, and they believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses. They believed in the Lord. They feared the Lord, and they recognized the great power of the Lord. And all of these things, pulling it all together, makes you understand this is a God that's worthy of reverence. This is a God that we should revere, not just based on what we think has been happening all this time, but now that we see that God is the God of judgment, who has judged our enemies, and then brought us salvation, and we have escaped that judgment into salvation, that leads to us saying, God is worth believing and following, and we have recognized everything that he is. And we are happy now that we realize this God's power, especially in the face of judgment and salvation. We are happy to be on the side of blessing and on the side of God, who will execute his power against us. Look at how Israel has seen this play out before their very eyes. In Exodus chapter 14, verse 14, you remember that Israel is on the edge of the sea and on the edge of the wilderness and on the edge of the Egyptian army. And so they cry out, Exodus 14:14 and Exodus 14:12, and saying, this is not this what we said to you in Egypt, leave us alone that we may serve the Egyptians, for it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness. And Moses said to the people, fear not, stand firm, and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today shall never be seen again. See the salvation of the Lord. And that's exactly what happens in verse 30. Thus the Lord saved Israel that day from the hand of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians. You see, what was told to them, what was essentially prophesied to them, what was promised to them, was made faith. What was promised to them was made sight. And so they could see right before their very eyes judgment and salvation. And they witnessed God do this by his power. And so realizing that power was very active in controlling the waters and controlling nature. Nature wasn't the God, but there was a God over all creation and over nature. And this God has used that to save them and judge their oppressor and their enemy. And so the people revered God for his power, for his judgment, for his salvation, for his authority that he has exercised over all of these things, and realizing this is our Lord in all capitals. His authority, and he is somebody to be feared with this authority. And they believed in the Lord, it says. And this belief is not, okay, I guess God exists now. No, God has been active throughout all of this time. This belief is they now trust in God. They're giving themselves over to God. They revere God now. And the difference between Israel and the Egyptians in believing in God is whose side that they are on. As this army is trying to pass through the same path that Israel is taking through the waters, it doesn't work out so well for them. Because God is using his power against them, God is judging them. They know that they have made God their enemy, and God knows that too. So in Exodus chapter 14, verse 23, it says this, the Egyptians pursued and went in after them into the midst of the sea. All Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen. And in the morning watch the Lord, and the pillar of fire and cloud looked down on the Egyptian forces and threw the Egyptian forces into a panic, clogging their chariot wheels so that they drove heavily. And the Egyptians said, let us flee from before Israel, for the Lord fights for them against the Egyptians. What do you think comes next? Do you think they say, okay, you know what, these people, they see it, they're, you know what, it's all good because they recognize my existence now, so we'll just float them to the top of the water and send them back to dry land. That's the opposite of what happens. In fact, they could probably somewhat understand that God did exist throughout this whole process, especially as the magicians, even just in the second plague, had to realize this is the finger of God doing all of these things. But just recognizing God's existence, maybe believing in God's existence, that there is a higher power, that there is a God, is not the same thing as having reverence for God and coming to God's side. You know, some Egyptians, as we read in chapter 13, there's this mixed rabble that could put that together, and those that could put it together have already come with Israel to be joined with them on the other side of the sea. But those that refuse to accept that God is to be revered that God is the authority will find themselves at the bottom of the sea in judgment. Thomas Hobbes in his book Leviathan simply says this: hell is truth seen too late. Hell is truth seen too late. Describing, even if you believe in God, but you don't want to revere God, you don't want to come to God's side, when truth is fully manifest, and that could have been the opposite for you. If you find yourself still making yourself the enemy of God, even in hell, it's truth that has come to you. God has fought against me, and I should have been on his side. Or think about this: the Emperor Julian the Apostate, ruling later, and Julian the Emperor was once a Christian and converted to paganism and moved into persecuting Christians, was lying dead, or dying on the battlefield rather. And as he's dying on the battlefield, he scooped up some of his own blood out of the mud on that battlefield, and he threw it up into the sky, and he said, "Thou hast conquered, O Galilean," referring to Jesus. You won, God. Fine. I'm dying. But does the existence and the recognition of the existence of God, and even saying, you know what, God, fine, you win, is that the same thing as revering God, honoring God, and being on God's side? You can admit the existence of God, but if you still think that you are more glorious, or God is smaller than everything that you desire, your feelings, your opinions, the things that you want to enforce that are contrary to God, you will find yourself making God your enemy. See, God's glory and everything that's wrapped up in God's glory, the God that will have victory over his enemies every single time, the God that executes judgment on the wicked and blessings on the righteous. God's glory demands reverence, and we must give God that due reverence. He is worthy of it, and when we find ourselves giving God this reverence, we will find ourselves blessed by God. And so the question stands: do you revere God? Not do you believe in God, do you revere God? Do you revere God and say, God, you are bigger than all things. You are bigger than everything that I could think of. You're bigger than my feelings, my opinions, everything that I want in my life. God, you are bigger than that. And so I will give myself over to you and find myself changed into being blessed by you throughout all of my days. And in the end, it will be absolutely worth it, especially as we're ushered into eternal life. Or do you find yourself more like Pharaoh and say, God has given me opportunities for repentance, maybe even 10 times. God has called out to me and showed me his plan. God has made contact with me and told me what's good. And in the midst of all of that, after God has given you all of that information and he's calling to you now, is your response like Pharaoh and deciding to harden your heart and saying, who is this God that I should listen to him? The choice is yours, whether you're going to harden your heart against God or if you're going to come to his side and have full reverence for him and be changed by him and find yourself passing through the waters of baptism and being baptized into Jesus Christ, who has made this separation and judging sin as unrighteous, but cutting us off from that sin and bringing us to life and to blessing. That's in effect what this whole story of the Exodus and the crossing of the Red Sea represents. And so the choice is yours. If you revere God, you will find yourselves passing through the waters of baptism and being made clean and whole and living a life to the very end, being blessed by God. Or you will find yourselves with this invitation and this opportunity given to you, hardening your heart and saying, not for me, whether God's there or not. But I would urge you to pass through the water. I would urge you to be found in the favor of God. to be found in the blessing power of God, and let him judge and execute those that persecute you. And that stands for you today as the invitation available. Or if you find yourself making God your enemy because you want things more than him, you want it your way more than him, the invitation is also open to have a conversation and a prayer for that as well. If there's anything that I can do for you in finding God's glory and having reverence for God, you can find me at the back as we stand and sing this song, When We All Get to Heaven.